Hey, English 101. I'm going to present some slides on thesis statements. I'm just making that a little bit bigger so you can see me. And I'll try and give as many examples as I can from March book one, but there'll be some other ones mixed in that are more general as we go along. I want to start by giving you a kind of an outline of what these slides are going to be about. We'll talk about how what a thesis statement is. It's a topic plus your main idea about the topic. So it's turning points of religion plus what you say about it or how you answer that question. So for turning points, it might be the turning points in John Lewis's life are these three things. And then if you really want to be good, you'd say something like, and they all add up to. We'll also talk about whether it's in that sweet spot of it being arguable. That means reasonable people can disagree with it. I'll talk a little bit about how to find the narrow path between arguable, between fantasy and fact. The third thing that we'll talk about, and this is the struggle that people have more than any others, is it narrow and specific enough? That's really a hard thing for people to do. In fact, the smarter you are, often the harder that is to do. The fourth thing is, does it provide a roadmap? And this kind of lays out the order that you're going to be discussing these subpoints in. And readers really like that because it kind of makes a promise. And I'll go into some details about that later. But as you fulfill that promise, people feel a connection to you and start to trust you as a writer. At the highest level, your thesis statement should be original. That means it should be your own thoughts, obviously. You're not picking up on what everybody else is saying or what's been already said in class. Some of that can be mixed in because, there's some of it that's just common sense. But really the challenge, the thing that makes an A paper, is that you've taken it and you've added something to what we understand about it. The location for it, I would think if you're just thinking of a 5-paragraph or 6-paragraph essay, it's at the end of the first paragraph. So you'd have your hook, and we'll talk about intro paragraphs in the next set of slides. Your hook, your background, and then it leads to a couple of sentences at the end, a sentence or two at the end of that first paragraph. The longer your paper it is, like if you have a 100-page paper, maybe your thesis statement comes out at the end of page 5 because you've just got that much setup to do. Let's see. It's not at the end of a college essay. So don't wait till the concluding paragraph. Don't ask a question and then only answer it at the very end. You want to tell us, as it says in this picture online for today's lesson plan, give us the bottom line up front. That's a military term. They say bluff. Give me the bluff right now. So tell us what you're going to say it. And then the conclusion, tell us what you just said. So you can repeat it, but it needs to be in the start of your paper. All right, so let's start with this. As I said, it's the main idea of your essay. Here's the thing that you're telling the reader that you're going to prove to them or demonstrate to them with your examples. It should be between obvious and fantasy, and that narrow path is the arguable one. That means it's not just a fact. Lincoln was the 16th president, or John Lewis is involved in the civil rights movement, because there's really no way to prove that other than to say it. There's no, Abraham Lincoln's the 16th president. Here's the votes. And then that would be the end of your argument. So you have to have something that people can kind of wrestle with. That's what makes the idea challenging. However, at the other end of it, and this gets harder and harder the more we get into conspiracy theories in this country, but fantasy, is it so far out that nobody would agree with it? So on one side, everyone would, and on the other side, no one would. And we want to be somewhere in the middle where reasonable people disagree. Like for a fantasy, you might say John Lewis was a lizard creature who was sent from outer space to infiltrate the government, work from within, and then eventually dominate us once he and others reveal themselves to be lizard people. That's an actual conspiracy theory online, not about John Lewis, but other politicians. So that one would be not reasonable because you couldn't really get many people to agree with that point of view that are thinking individuals. And now here, as I said earlier, this is the one that's really the hard one to get figured out, is how do you narrow it down? So somebody recently sent me an email that said, Mr. Peters, I want my thesis to be about events in his life, people in his life, and things that he's read in his life. And that's nice. They've got a nice ring to it. They've got 3 things that they're going to talk about, but it's this huge topic. That would be several books to try and cover that in a 3 to 5 page paper. So this really has to do with what they call scope. What's the right scope for your paper? And in 3 to 5 pages, you can't say a ton. In fact, the you can't prove a lot, so you really want to find a narrow thing to write about. And the old expression is you want it to be not a mile wide and an inch deep. You want it to be an inch wide and a mile deep. And this depth part, that's the evidence that you're providing, the support that you're giving for it. One other common expression is say a lot about a little rather than a little about a lot. So rather than just skim the surface, give us that depth of something very narrow. So for instance, you could even say, here's 3 ways that the Bible influenced him. Just narrow it straight down to that gift that he got and say, these are the things that he learned from the Bible, and have each of those be a body paragraph. But it'd be perfectly acceptable to say, here are 3 events in his life, and then to give it examples in those body paragraphs. So, for instance, the March Trilogy shows how African Americans protested for and won their voting rights. That's an enormous, in fact, it takes the trilogy to make that point. You couldn't do it in 3 to 5 pages. Here's one that's much more narrow. While there were many factors in the successful battle for equal rights for blacks in the 1960s, according to the March Trilogy, the social gospel movement, or the idea that Christians should help the needy, formed the philosophical background for the leaders of the protests. So I'm going to really focus in on this social gospel that Martin Luther King talks about and say as much as I can about how it influenced the 60s and maybe John Lewis in particular. Be specific. So sometimes you can be narrow, but you can still be sort of vague about what your reasons are or what exactly you're trying to say about it. Here's a definition of what the word vague means. It means not clearly expressed, stated in indefinite terms, no precise meaning. And there's a kind of a little joke about being vague. Take that drink to give you time to read it. This word right down here, thing, is often one that's a key to it being very vague. So, for instance, here's a vague one. There were lots of conflicts, okay, that's broad, between John Lewis and other civil rights leaders in the 1960s over how to accomplish their goals of equal treatment. Here's something that's much more specific, much more targeted. The 1960s push for equal rights for African Americans suffered from internal conflicts. There were tensions between older generations and the new leaders, as well as debates over the use of violence and the inclusion of whites in the movement. In fact, this essay topic right here is one that we'll use for our second essay. That's a possibility, is to write about conflicts within the civil rights movement. So that's much more specific and not so vague as lots of conflicts. Here's one way where you can narrow it down and make it more specific or more accurate and precise, is to use a special set of vocabulary called qualifiers. And you can take a look. Here are some examples of them. So few or rarely, perhaps. And the idea is that instead of saying always or never, unqualified statements, you can say something that's more easily proven and more accurate. It's not just that you're trying to make it easily proven, it's that you're trying to be more precise with your language. So you could say most or many, and that would be more accurate than all or none. Here's an example of this in use. Efforts to reduce drug use have failed. That means all efforts to reduce all drugs have failed completely. However, take a look at this next one, which shows a good use of a qualifier to start out with, and then it makes it even more specific with a narrowed down claim. So most efforts. That's good. Now we have something that limits our claim. We don't say all, we say most, and that makes it, gives you some control over the terms of the argument. In Texas, now we're getting narrowed down, to reduce, not all drugs, marijuana use, not among everybody, among high school students have failed. So those qualifiers that they add, Texas, high school, marijuana, most, that narrows it down. Then one most comes from this kind of set of language right here we call qualifiers. So I highly recommend trying to find a way to use qualifiers in your thesis statement to make it more accurate and precise. Next, and I sometimes say this is optional, I really like a roadmap. And I think your readers do for very specific reasons. They feel like when you say, here are the reasons I'm going to tell you about, and then you go through them in that order, and that's really important, then your reader feels like you're fulfilling the promise that you make at the start of the paper. So I highly suggest laying out your reasons for your main idea about the main topic. Let me give you an example of how that looks. And I've used red right there because I think of these as kind of words that stand out and that you'll use again in your topic sentence. So let's say we're going to do a rhetorical analysis. That means we're going to analyze the rhetoric in MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, which you've looked at. In his letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King uses rhetorical strategies, to persuade his audience of other clergy members. These include appeals to the emotional images of police misconduct, to his credibility as a concerned citizen, and most of all to the airtight logic of his reasons for direct action. So I'm going to use in my paper, in the order, the word emotional in the first body paragraph, probably in the very first sentence of the first body paragraph. I might use a different word, slightly different word. Like for emotional, I could use pathos, right? And then the next body paragraph would be about credibility, or maybe I'd switch to use ethos. And the last one would be logic in the third body paragraph, in that order. And maybe in that topic sentence, I would use the word logos instead. So these terms in red right here are really going to be kind of a thread. I think of it as like stitching on a baseball for some reason. It's that red thread that holds the two sides of the leather on a baseball. And that's what's going to bring your essay together and continue to remind the reader of what you said you were going to talk about in your thesis statement. So I really like roadmaps or predictive thesis statements. It gives flow. It helps with transitions. And it really just, they say, I say, they call these return sentences when you come back and use the same language or synonyms. That's the word I was looking for. Synonyms for those terms. So maybe you don't sound too repetitive. Finally, before we get to the last couple of slides here, the really high bar is to be original. How can you make your paper stand out? And I've just copied and pasted this in. I've never had this slide in before, but this is from our lesson plan from today's class and yesterday's as well about how to be original. And one thing you might think is, first, we know pretty much that people are going to talk about turning points. There's a lot of people talking about turning points. So if you want to really take a risk and be more original, talk about religion in the first book. But even if you're sticking with turning points, here's some ways within that box that you can strike out on your own. One is that after the quote, where I said that's where you really make your money in your paper with your analysis, how you explain that quote is going to be totally your own. So even if you had the exact same quotes as the next person in class, what you say about it is really a chance to be original, your own interpretation. Maybe you find quotes that we haven't talked about in class, and there's lots of those, and some of those could be some of the videos or historical background links that we put in class or your own research. If you do that extra work and do some digging, your paper is going to stand out as original because it's not going to use the same quote that everyone else is straight from the stuff that we've already discussed in class. This one's tricky, and I don't have any great shortcuts for how to do this, but make inferences. So rather than just summarize a quote word for word, try and draw it out a little bit more. Try and say what you think is the subtext of the quote, or try and make a connection between that quote and something that happens much later in the book. So if you're talking about what he learns in the Bible and the kind of things that he says to his chickens, can we later see that taking effect when he's arrested, for instance, at the end of the book? Do some of those Beatitudes come back into play later? That kind of inference between one event and a more later event can make your paper stand out and be more original. The intro and conclusion, which, as I said, is our next set of slides after this, that's a place where you really want to take a shot at creative writing. So a lot of the times when I'm teaching this class, I feel like I'm putting people in a box and I'm trying to find ways for you to break out of it, even to work within that structure of a college essay and of claim plus support. That's just got to be there, and almost no matter what you do. But your intro and your conclusion, as you'll see in the next set of slides, That's where you can be a creative writer. That's where that part of you that really wants to be original can find a way to grab our attention and to leave us with something strong to think about. The second to last one is eloquence. And as I've said I think I said this in a Zoom meeting, the right word put at the right time in the right order and with the right syntax. That means the order of the words. That means the rhythm of the words, the music of the language that you use, the verb choice. That's the one really to look at if you're talking about word choice. Those verbs, that vocabulary that you use in your essay, that can kind of form a sense of eloquence for your reader, that something has been really well said. So think about that right at the end of when you're going to turn your paper in. So with a day to go, maybe think, how can I add some poetry to this paper? Turns of phrase, metaphors, sense of humor even could be considered a form of eloquence. And then finally, flawless execution. So it's not uncommon for people to make mechanical mistakes, to make spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes or punctuation mistakes, to make errors in paper format or MLA style. So if everything is locked down, your paper is going to stand out as being really carefully gone through with a tooth and comb, and that will make your paper unusual among most papers. That isn't to say everybody's papers are sloppy, but a paper that's been very carefully edited and proofread. I know that doesn't sound like originality, but if you read a bunch of papers like your teachers do, that can make your paper stand out. Okay, finally, we call this a tentative thesis statement because as you're writing, you may discover new things. That is one of the absolute joys of writing, is that you write to discover. Winston Churchill, the leader of Britain during World War II, said, "How do I know what I think until I see what I've said?" I'm going to say that again. Churchill said, "How do I know what I think until I see what I've said?" So for him, the process of having a great idea, having a strong main idea, like a thesis statement, came at the end of the process. And he could kind of then see, after he'd written everything, what his main point was. So as you're writing, you may discover connections that you hadn't thought of before. So right now, before you write your draft, this is tentative. By the time you finish your paper, you may want to come back and revise that thesis statement so that it stands out and says really exactly what you want to say. I'm sorry if I traumatized you with this kitten, but I think it really helps you to remember this point. All right, so here's the checklist at the very end. And there's one last little bit here, I guess, that I haven't talked about, and that'll be the last thing, I think. Does my thesis attempt to answer or explore a challenging intellectual question? I wrote the question, so I think hopefully we've got that part covered. Is the point I'm making one that would generate argument or would leave people asking, so what? Well, so what? There were turning points. Well, if you say there were turning points that led him to this direction, now you've got something that people are going to care, and maybe, as they say, and they say, I say, draw people into the ongoing conversation. Number 3, is it too vague or too general? Should I try and be more specific? And we had a couple of good slides about that. Does my thesis indicate the direction of my argument? Does it suggest a structure? That's that roadmap with those bright red words that you're going to use throughout your paper in your topic sentences, that thread that you can stitch through it, that promise that you're keeping to your readers. Does my introductory paragraph define terms? And this isn't so much about a thesis statement as it kind of leads us to talk about intros, which are, as I've said several times, the next set of slides. And then finally, is the language of my thesis vivid and clear? And you'll see, if I go to this next slide, there's a bunch of sample thesis statements. And some of them have all of these elements, but the language just gets a little bit tangled up and clunky. And that could be because it's overwritten or overthought. Maybe it could be because you need to make a long sentence into several shorter sentences to keep the ideas separate and to keep the flow a little bit easier for your reader. But think as you revise your final step in writing a thesis statement, it's kind of like that final step about eloquence. Maybe it's proofreading and editing and just having the right words in the right order that would make your thesis statement pop and be vivid. These next ones are some sample thesis statements on social gospel. Here's some for the next essay. topic, and essay 2, not one of our topics yet, but after you've read all 3 books. This one's from some thesis statements that we don't use anymore about influences on him. Visual analysis, these will be for the second essay as well. So we'll return to some of these, and there's a few on turning points here. I think there's 5 on turning points. That's it. So that's the end of the slides. You can look at these sample thesis statements if you like, but there's an exercise that goes with this where it looks at just the turning point ones and the ones about religion. And it asks you some questions about it. These ones are here if you want to look at them. They're not all perfect, but they give you an idea of some direction you can go. Okay, I think that's it. I hope this presentation helped, and good luck writing your thesis. Ask me questions if you need to. Send emails. I'll give you some feedback as we go so that you don't start writing your rough draft or don't finish your rough draft without some feedback from me on your thesis and your outline. Good luck.